Hello, welcome. I'm just going to give it a few moments while people trickle in before we get started. So nice to see so many people today. This is great. Again, just giving it a couple minutes here while people join. For those of you who are just attending. Okay, well, I think we can get started. So welcome to Archives Are Not Neutral. My name is Greg Stewart. I am the Education Programs Manager at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, or CCAHA, and I use he, they pronouns. I am a white person with glasses and brown hair, wearing a reddish jacket, and my background is intentionally blurred so that you can't see all the boxes behind me. And just a bit more about today's talk, so you know what to expect. So while conventional wisdom holds that archivists should refrain from taking subjective stances in their work, there have been increasing calls in the field to recognize that the historical record from which archives are drawn is far from neutral. The big question we're asking today is, how can we expect archivists to remain objective when engaging with politically fraught materials that are potentially held within institutions founded on principles that do not reflect current societal values? So before we get to our speaker's presentation, just some Zoom housekeeping. So you are in Zoom webinar, which means that your video and audio are turned off, but you can ask questions or make comments to us in the chat at any time. The program is auto closed captioned in English, and you can turn on subtitles with the little CC button in the Zoom toolbar. The format for today, we're going to have a presentation from our speaker, followed by a Q&A with you, and I'll pop back on the screen when it's time for that, just to moderate those questions. But again, please feel free to ask questions at any time during the program. And this program is being recorded, and we'll send a recording as well as the PowerPoint and some additional resources in a follow-up email. Finally, I want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities, the William Penn Foundation, and the Independence Foundation, who make today's program possible. So Dyani, if you could hit the next slide, please. So just a little quick note about the organization I work for, the CCAHA. We are a regional conservation lab and preservation services facility. We're based in Philadelphia, but we work with organizations and clients all across the country. Our conservators treat paper-based objects like books, photographs, documents, artworks on paper, and more. And our preservation services staff work in the field, providing education programs like this one and helping institutions plan for the future of their collections. The center also offers a wide range of digitization services, as well as fundraising assistance, housing, framing.
Unfortunately, I think Greg's connection may be a bit unstable. So I will just kind of take over from here. I think they got the gist of it. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dyani Feige. I'm the Director of Preservation Services here at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. I use she, her pronouns, and as a point of visual access, I am a woman with glasses, a white woman with grayish brown curly hair, in my early 40s. I'm sitting in my office, and you can see a bit of a bookshelf in the back, although I will be turning off my screen in a second. And it looks like Greg's back, so I'm not sure what other
Oh boy,
housekeeping.
I'm sorry. The internet down here just went
Yeah.
out. So, but we're back.
Yeah.
So maybe it's not as reliable as I thought, but I'll keep soldiering on. I think I was just about to read your bio,
Okay.
Dyani. Did I get through
Sounds
it?
good.
Okay. Our speaker, as you have just met her, is Dyani Feige. She is the Director of Preservation Services here at the center. And Dyani works with libraries, archives, museums, and other cultural organizations to conduct needs and risk assessments, assist in disaster planning, and help develop policy and planning documents for collections. She also develops and presents education programs on preservation and conservation concerns. Before joining the staff of the CCAHA in 2010 as preservation specialist, Dyani worked in the Brooklyn Museum Library and Archives. She has also worked in the New York Public Library's Preservation Division, for the Conference Board, and in the Special Collections of Archives at Kent State University. Dyani received her MS in Library and Information Science with a certificate in Archives at Pratt Institute, and her BM in Music Business from New York University. Okay, I was trying to read that as fast as possible so we can get moving, but I will now turn it over to Dyani to take it away from here.
Great. Thank you, Greg. And as I mentioned, I am going to turn off my video just so I don't distract myself, but I will be back at the end when we are going to take questions. So, first off, just as kind of an expectation setting note to start things off, this topic is not my primary area of focus or expertise. One of the things we at the Conservation Center pride ourselves on doing is being a connector, being a repository of various resources and disseminating those to our audience. So if you are particularly well versed in this topic, if you have a lot of, if you are very well read or have a lot of experience enacting some of the practices that we're going to be talking about, you may not learn anything terribly new or groundbreaking today. Throughout the presentation, I will definitely be recommending a lot of scholars and initiatives that are creating new innovative thoughts and content on the topic. And I hope there will be some helpful takeaways there. So Greg shared kind of my professional academic bio, and as just a very brief background of who I am professionally and what brings me to this topic, I am, of course, presently working in and have been for quite a while a preservation role, not within a collecting repository. I do have a background in archives, though, as Greg mentioned, and I pursued my preservation learning through library school, not a conservation or museum studies program. So I am familiar with kind of the traditional academic practice within this field. When asked about what got me into the field of preservation, though, I like to make sure folks understand the social justice element of the practice. We would not have collections without preservation, and we would not have history without preservation. My social justice approach to it is by acknowledging that by making decisions about what to preserve, we are literally determining the information and knowledge that those who come after us will be able to learn from. Preservation shapes our understanding of the world. In working with organizations throughout the country and internationally representing countless topics and populations, I have developed a passionate appreciation for documenting and giving voice to the vastly different experiences chronicled in these collections. And as an employee responsible for the preservation of our nation's and world's stories, I understand my critical role in the protection and interpretation of these voices. So with that, I wholeheartedly believe that diversity and inclusion have a really vital role in preservation. The stewardship of collections ultimately affects the actual stories of the collections items as they progress through time. So the cultures that created the items must be respected in the strategies used to preserve them. And to speak specifically to the transmission of information, which is largely what we're talking about when we talk about preserving archives, as librarian Stacy Williams wrote, neutrality doesn't encourage our critical thinking. It doesn't ask us to question facts that are wrong or behaviors that are prejudiced. By this measure, neutrality doesn't necessarily reveal injustice, but further entrenches it, which is ironic. But just to level set and to be completely transparent about the privilege that I bring to my role, I am, as you will see in the next few slides that have some demographics about the archival field and the conservation field, very indicative of the majority of the field. You can see up here on the left, just some of my demographics. I am very typical. The A Census survey report regarding demographics in the archives field bears this out. The vast majority of archivists, at least who responded to this census, identify as white, female. I am a tiny smidge older than the majority number here for age, but still, you know, pretty solidly average. And yet, the Society of American Archivists has these various commitments to diversity as indicated in their mission statement and previous strategic plan. They did just re-release a new strategic plan, as well as a separate statement on diversity and inclusion. I don't call these out to point fingers specifically at the concept that they're doing a terrible job. I don't think they are, because I really do believe that overall the intentions are there. But just to be really clear that words are only as good as the paper or screen they're written on, unless they're backed up with actions. So there is still a lot of work to do. There's a bit less recent and less comprehensive demographic data available for the conservation field, but here are some figures specifically on race in particular from 2018. And, you know, again, this is pretty dramatic, but probably not entirely shocking. I will note that the conservation field is largely, well, I should say majority female as well, though not quite as dramatically as archives. And as well, the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation also indicate in their core values this strong commitment to diversity. So acknowledging the issues is one step in the right direction, right? But definitely not the entirety. Back to the archives for the majority of this discussion. Let's dive into the concept of archival neutrality or lack thereof. It's a topic that has gotten a lot more attention for sure within the past 10 years or so, but it's not brand new. As early as 1970, Howard Zinn gave a talk to the Society of American Archivists in which he asserted the archivist, in subtle ways, tends to perpetuate the political and economic status quo simply by going about his ordinary business. His supposed neutrality is, in other words, a fake. I think there's something to be said even in that quote about his choice of gender pronouns, but we'll get more to that later. But still, for many, many years, including while I was in library school in the very early 2000s, we were taught that archivists' roles were to be completely objective, to simply transmit factual information. Use the words of the creators in your descriptions of the materials, we were told. And if it's something like the objects this business produced could be known as either widgets or doodads, and this business always referred to them as widgets, 100% use that word. Cross-reference it if doodads is maybe more widely familiar, but that's that. But there are definitely other cases that are not this cut and dry, particularly when it comes to words that are used to describe other people, when it comes to words that were used in the past that are considered or known to be harmful now. Ways of describing oneself or one's family that foregrounds particular facets of the story while completely leaving out, for example, the fact that they enslaved numerous individuals and relied on their labor to get to the point of wealth or renown where researchers might be interested in reading about the family today. This intention to be purely objective and, keep just the facts. This puts all of the work on the researchers to, in some cases, have to read between the lines and to make the moral judgments. And this image on the screen, by the way, is a snapshot from my own copy of Developing and Maintaining Practical Archives by Gregory S. Hunter, the second edition, which was published in 2003. To be fair, calling out that particular portion and its use of the word objectivity might not be entirely judicious to the base sentiment. It is important to recognize that in everything we're going to be talking about today, I'm not suggesting that by recognizing we can't fall back on the illusion of neutrality, we should all let loose and start inserting personal opinions, tastes, and etc. into the work we do. We can still strive for objectivity. The lesson to just present factual assertions without embellishment still stands, but we may need to dive a little further and unpack the factual assertions, try to present a wider range of them, place them into a context to give the researcher as close to the entirety of the picture as we can. We're still putting the work on the researcher in a certain sense, but we're just giving them a bit more to go on. A certain level of objectivity is a professional responsibility. But pretending that we can be fully neutral is ignoring the entirety of the context that we are working within. To put it in a slightly different way, and to hint at the what can we actually do about this portion of the talk that I'll get to in a little bit, the challenge is when attempting to be as objective as we possibly can be in the pursuit of ultimate neutrality, we might fall into the trap of avoiding controversy, reinforcing assumptions and stereotypes, and missing a potential opportunity to do some good. As Thomas L. Haskell wrote, this was specifically about historians, but I think the concept is very smoothly transferred to archivists as well. Historians and others can be objective without forsaking engagement in discussion of values, politics, or social policy. But again, more on that a bit later. So just to set the stage, here are some of the baseline assumptions that we are working with. As Sam Wynn stated in 2017, the historic record has been repeatedly muddled and punctuated by perfectly, there are quotes, honest scholars who thought they were telling the truth. Archivists are not exempt from this defect. In fact, our hubristic trust in our capacity for objectivity makes us rather dangerous custodians. This comes because archives are created and described by humans. We all bring our own experiences, context, and biases to the work that we do. And as much as we might try to stand back from those, to learn about other experiences and contexts beyond our own to influence the work that we do, that's where we're coming from. That is kind of our baseline. Beyond just the individual, even the systems and standards put in place to try to reduce choice and subjectivity, things like standard tools for archival description, like describing archives a content standard. These tools and standards were created by humans, typically white humans with relative privilege. So I should mention the caveat here that I'm largely talking about what, for lack of a better term, we can call institutional archives. Not in the sense that they're the archives of a particular institution necessarily, but that they are held within relatively traditional, I recognize that word has its own problems, but let's just accept it as a fallback. Relatively traditional collecting organizations. So academic institutions, museums, libraries, historic sites, etc. There is a whole lot that archives in these sorts of organizations can learn from community archivists and activists, and we'll touch on that a little bit later too. Another relatively, in the scheme of things, early quote on this topic from Terry Cook, who in 1997 stated that archivists have changed from being passive keepers of an entire documentary residue left by creators to becoming active shapers of the archival heritage. I personally, and I think many of the practitioners today would argue, I'm not sure it's the archivists themselves that have changed, but the understanding and context of their role in the preservation of history. So in a vacuum, when we talk about this striving for neutrality, what would it look like for archives to be truly neutral? These points were kind of off the top of my head, and it's possible you could think of more. If you can, you're certainly welcome to drop them in the chat. But in thinking about removing all hint of interpretation and even value-driven description, we're really getting to some kind of impossible ideal where everything is data, everything is basically standardized and maybe even quantifiable. This is not ever going to be the case and has never been the case. Everything within archival collections is not fully consistent and standardized, and everything is not fully equal. All right, so unpacking all of this a little bit further. The human element is important, of course, but we also have to remember that there are systems in place guiding us as humans, whether we're consciously aware of it on a regular basis or not. These include systems at a very high level, like the society and cultural context in which we operate. In the United States, many would acknowledge this as a white supremacy culture. The institutions within which we work then have their own certain structures in place that are supposed to drive our decisions. And again, to a certain extent, that's important. We do need some framework, some guidance to work effectively. But of course, many of these institutions have their own roots, or worse than roots, are still embedded within the power imbalances of society. So starting at the institutional level and sort of drilling down, though it's not an entirely hierarchical path, the very infrastructures that have this responsibility of quote unquote traditional collecting are themselves exclusionary. museums, libraries, academic institutions, all of the broad types of or collecting organizations that I mentioned were initially created largely for a certain type of privileged individual to begin with. They were inherently exclusionary in their welcoming practices, who was allowed to visit, who was allowed to use the collections. Even public libraries, when they were initially founded in the US in the first half of the 19th century, they were ostensibly for the edification of the masses, which, while great in concept, pretty much excluded those who couldn't read. And this, of course, was disproportionately going to include enslaved individuals, women, those living in rural areas, etc. And then once more and more people across the demographics were able to read, libraries, public libraries began segregating and opening separate libraries for different individuals. Academic institutions, of course, are going to be even more restrictive, even more segregationist and hierarchical, and the ultimate of the quote unquote ivory tower as far as exclusionary practices. So drilling down from there, we've got the framework within which these collections exist. We've got the society, we've got the institutions. Let's start with the next kind of gateway through which all archives, again, specifically the context that we are talking about, traditional, quote unquote, traditional collecting organizations, deciding what is actually worthy of being collected. Here are a few excellent quotes on the topic, coming at it from slightly different angles. As you might be able to tell, the word quote is more aimed at libraries, but I think the sentiment is relevant here too. Let's be clear. It is a privilege to walk into a repository and recognize that a significant portion of the materials collected and preserved there represent some facet of an identity that you share. When we experience the opposite, when we don't see ourselves reflected in the record, we do not share that privilege. So I'll just pause on this for a second to give you a moment to read these fantastic quotes. And again, as Greg mentioned, I will be sending out a bibliography with many of the resources that I consulted to put this presentation together following the program. By deciding what to collect and preserve as part of an archive, basic economic principles tell us that there is a counter decision that something else is being left out. Resources are finite. Since again, it is humans making these selections, and our understanding of value and significance has evolved and continues to over time, this inevitably means that truly the majority of what could conceivably be considered documentary evidence has actually not been collected. Human nature is to center ourselves in the story. It's not a bad thing to want to keep your own family album and not that of a complete random stranger. We just have to recognize that we're bringing this nature to the table, and again, whether we are kind of consciously aware of it or not, to the work that we do as archive practitioners. But I think it's really important to point out that just because it's not intentional doesn't mean that it's not happening or not harmful. The concept of neglectful complacency. The people with the most power and influence are the people who set up our institutions historically. So naturally, the people with power and influence consider the evidence of their lives to be important and worth saving. I'm sure it will come as no surprise then to conclude that far more of the traditional archival record comprises white men than equals their representation in the world. I got some of the specific language on this slide from a library guide on researching primary materials in the Ohio University Archives and Special Collections. So I'm linking to that statement here as well, in which they kind of overtly explain that, yeah, there is stuff that maybe on a purely representational sense should be included here in this material, but you will not find it. And this is a very broad strokes explanation of why. So we've talked about collections, finding their way in the door. Next, we're going to talk about the way that we work with collections once we have them, the way that we work with materials once we deem them kind of worthy of being collections. Along with original order, one of the most fundamental principles of archival processing and management is that of provenance, the focus on the creator or collector, but more often the quote unquote creator. This is the principle that, in simple terms, records from one creator should not be mixed with another. And this is part of, what helps us determine what is considered a separate collection. But if we look at that kind of obsessive focus on there being one very clear creator, we can probably see how this might start to break down. I'll use an example of missionary records that documented individuals living in quote unquote non-Western areas of the world. While there certainly may be a wealth of informational value in the fact that these missionaries recorded demographics about the individuals living there, who may otherwise very likely have not been documented in the written record, who owns that information? Why is that information? Why was that created by the missionaries? But provenance tells us that is the owner. The same goes, of course, for enslaved populations in the United States, residents or prisoners at institutions like the highly problematic mental hospitals. The list could go on and on. It makes sense, and you can continue the ball of string as a concept, but hopefully you can also see how much of a power imbalance that concept can reinforce. When this emerged as a concept in archives, the vast majority of those individuals who had any control or ownership over their own humanity, whether structurally or actually legally, were, not to be a broken record, but white men. The other problem, and this is kind of a far more practical than ethical or philosophical issue with provenance. This very traditional concept of ownership or even creation is a lot less clear when it comes to digital records. So on kind of a practical level, rethinking provenance has to happen most critically within the field of digital preservation. Stewardship of digital records can be shared and complex. I know that, even if I copy over something from a Word document into something that is my writing, the actual owner may be listed as an individual who created the first Word document, and on down kind of rabbit holes of confusion of when the file was last updated, et cetera, et cetera. Community archives, again, particularly those with a digital focus, are taking the lead on looking at this. One of the suggestions that Jarrett M. Drake, who has done a lot of writing and speaking on this topic, considers is that, as it says on the screen here, users should see names not from an authorized source or agency, but names asserted by people, organizations, and communities responsible for the shared creation, stewardship, and custody of records. This is his suggestion to looking at the concept of provenance in a different way. And I'll leave this slide with one more quote from the same individual. We archivists must resist our colonial inclinations and realize that not all who are named are truthful, and not all who are unnamed are deceitful. Slight segue, because mostly along the way I have been talking about unintentional biases and exclusions from the record, but it is really important to acknowledge as well that sometimes these exclusions or manipulations are all too intentional. Unfortunately, that often happens when governmental, institutional, or corporate corruption is involved. And we could spend all day discussing particular case studies and upsetting cover-ups along these lines, but instead I'll try to put things in at least a relatively positive perspective and just share that in the US, some of these highly significant law acts have been passed in response to some of the major incidents of basically archival mismanagement. So the Freedom of Information Act, the Presidential Records and Materials Act, and the Sarbanes-Oxley Act all were enacted to some extent in response to mishandling of records. Of course, I can say with almost complete certainty, we will never entirely get away from this, but the more we confront it, the more we can strive for an open, authentic, historic record. So we talked about the obvious and practical exclusion of things not being collected and preserved in the first place. And then next from there, we're on to understanding that the way things described can impact the way information is accessible. This is a level of archival science that's not just about what's there, but how it is described or not. Overtly offensive language is an obvious one, and for probably obvious reasons, I'm not going to list examples of that here, but racial slurs, other, clearly intentionally harmful language is certainly an example. Language once common and thought to be inoffensive that's now understood to be harmful is a very common area of critical attention in language. One of the biggest examples, of course, being the recognition that enslaved individuals is a far more humanizing and respectful term, although it's still quite troubling. Language with ingrained bias depending on where you are on the side of the table, is it a war in Ukraine or is it a special military operation? A point that doesn't really come with harm, but is kind of an inevitable example of the growth and evolution of language that has changed over time. We have a lot of examples within technology, of course, and that's why I have this lovely stock image from, it looks like the late 90s, early 2000s. But, I have a 12-year-old daughter, and I'm sure she has never heard the term mobile phone used for her cell phone. So, and tech is kind of the most obvious example of that, but there certainly are other examples as well. And then another, back to those that can cause harm, obscured identities. So referring to women by their husband's name, or referring to records that were created by perhaps the CEO's administrative assistant, but the CEO gets the credit. Just some examples. And that leads us to the problem with the default. And I have an image of this robin up here on the slide because of the picture a bird exercise, where apparently some significant number of folks will have a robin immediately spring to mind if you give them that prompt. I guess a robin is, at least in the US, the platonic ideal of a generic bird. The problem is, if I ask folks to picture a doctor, some significant number of folks on the street would likely picture a white, middle-aged male doctor. This is, as suggested in the obscured identities, sort of, category on the previous slide, reflected in archival description. Race, ethnicity, and gender tend to be called out far more frequently when they are not the default. And as the thought I shared earlier about not seeing oneself in the record suggests here too, this is immediately alienating and unwelcoming to a huge swath of the population. Elvia Arroyo Ramirez wrote a really fantastic case study on processing the Juan Bellman files at Princeton University about challenges with language, challenges with processing a majority Spanish language collection in a US institution. One of the most kind of practical challenges she had, and the reason that I included this here to talk about language, was issues with diacritics in the file names. Word processing systems in the United States are not defaulted to recognize those diacritics, and the same goes for the digital ingesting that she was working on while processing born digital materials within this particular collection. She and her colleagues posted some queries on message boards, listservs, etc., and got a whole kind of wealth of responses and suggestions, but none of them were really great suggestions. There was a lot of language and suggestion around removing the diacritics in order to process the files, framed in such a way that assumed basically that Spanish was inferior to English, whereas removing the diacritics could actually completely change the word. So as she wrote in this piece that I've linked here, keeping the linguistic integrity of these file and folder names shouldn't be a compromise on an ideal. It is the very practical responsibility of processing archivists and other digital curation laborers to preserve as much of the original content and context of the collections we've been entrusted to preserve and provide access to. I just experienced this firsthand when downloading and working with a number of files shared by colleagues at an institution in Puerto Rico with whom we are partnering. So what can we do about this particular challenge? This is actually, the challenge of language is one that actually has a pretty direct response. Not to say that it's easy or straightforward, but the practice of reparative description has gotten a lot of attention in the field, and in a couple minutes I'll have a whole slide of a number of really great resources on that topic in particular. So reparative description basically is the concept of going back and changing previously written descriptions, primarily finding aids, but could be catalog records as well, aiming to remediate or contextualize potentially outdated or harmful language. And that is aiming to work towards collections descriptions that appropriately represent subjects and is discoverable by patrons. So it's not just about the harm, right? It's also about the cross-referencing mobile phone term so that the future researchers will know what they were talking about. These are, as I mentioned, not a simple, not necessarily a straightforward process. We have to remember that this may take a long time. We're not going to solve it in a day. It may be really beneficial to think of it as an iterative process where we kind of take one piece of one collection's finding aid and work through that to see how the experience proceeds, and then go back and adjust later. Definitely engaging others who will be able to share accurately for other communities, engaging those individuals from those communities to learn how they want to be described, and also engaging individuals who speak languages other than English if the records are in languages other than English, so you're able to get more content there. The best we can do when it comes to description is considering and incorporating both content and context in order to best understand what we are actually collecting and preserving. Another thing that a number of organizations have done is, in recognizing that we're not going to fix this in a day, have developed what are known as harmful language statements. I included the top link is a list of links to a number of these statements. And then the bottom chunk of text here is excerpted from one particular harmful language statement at Temple University. So acknowledging that there very well may be language found within these materials that is harmful, we can't fix it all, and hopefully what the institution is doing about it. I'm winding down here, gonna bring it around to some not solutions, but next steps. But I did want to just bring it back to the field that I am working within presently, and recognize that work is happening within the conservation and preservation field as well. I pulled some of the goals from the American Institute for Conservation's Held in Trust report from the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Accessibility section, primarily around people-led conservation and preservation practices, a great deal of which involves working with stakeholder communities in inclusive ways. Not that this solves the neutrality issue, but is, I think, a really important next step. So what can we actually do to address this? Again, it's really important to acknowledge that any of these actions we put into place to try to address the situation at hand are not going to solve things. This is all in the pursuit of a more complete, diverse, and authentic record. So at a base level, we can be thoughtful. We can acknowledge the privilege and context that we bring to our roles. And if we as individuals are bringing different types of or relatively less privileged to the roles, then that is going to influence the work that we do as well. This is a big one, but it would be really fantastic if academic programs continue incorporating cultural competency training into scholarly pursuits. Hold institutions and professional associations accountable for actually pursuing these initiatives. Again, it's one thing to make a statement. It's a good thing to make a statement, but what are they actually doing to follow up on that statement? Involving the communities throughout the entirety of the archival process. Sometimes this means working with communities of whose collections institutions may be taking and stewarding. Sometimes it means educating and working with communities who are going to keep their own collections within the community, which is perfectly fine and wonderful as well. So, the idea of partnering rather than trying to take. Providing access to a wider user base, in part by being receptive to a wider range of needs that can include through language, through access policies, etc. And be willing to take a stand, not only individually, but collectively as a field. So there, where was I? So this is just scratching the surface and mostly links in here so that you have the links, but most of these links are up here because they include not only good content themselves, but lots of additional links out to other resources as well on reparative description initiatives. And again, I will sound like a different type of broken record, but this list of community-centered collecting initiatives is also just barely scratching the surface. There are some really well-known projects on the list, at least within this field, and some smaller ones. A quick Google will probably also call up lists or examples within your region of the world or area of collecting interest. But I would definitely encourage you to check some of these out and learn about what they are doing. So I think one of the simplest but biggest takeaways here is just this. The archivist's role is not passive. We are human with our own backgrounds and experiences, and even if we were mechanized robots, at least at this point, those robots will have been programmed by humans. Essentially, every step of the archival process, from considering what to collect, to arranging and describing, to allocating resources around management and preservation, is an active endeavor in which we have a great responsibility to shape the world's collective histories. By hiding behind this elusive concept of neutrality, practitioners are actually not only making ourselves socially irrelevant, but reinforcing the oppression. And that is what I have prepared. As I mentioned, I will send out a bibliography following the presentation along with the slides. And it looks like we have at least a few minutes for questions. So I will pop my video back on.
Hi, sorry, I'm just a little out of breath. I moved to a different room because my internet was not stable. Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, please put those in the chat. Maybe I can get us started. I mean, I was having kind of one thought. Okay, give me a second. Which is I was thinking about like archives where people are sort of both seen and not seen, if that makes sense. Like I'm thinking about there's an anthropologist named Benedict Anderson who writes, do you know the book Imagined Communities, Dyani?
No, I'm not familiar.
So he's kind of writing about like colonial archives in particular.
Okay.
And he has a chapter on, it's called the Census Map and Museum, and how these forces have kind of created divisions between cultures that are not real, right?
Sure,
It's about a
sure.
colonial project of like dividing and conquering in some
Okay.
ways. Um, and I'm just wondering if you came to, at sort of across any case studies or anything like that on this topic in terms of like from an archivist perspective about like what do you do in this case where it's like, yes, you're kind of documenting the history of this people, but from such a skewed way and with
Yeah,
such like an agenda, if that makes sense.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can't say that I am familiar with any case studies like very specifically on a similar topic, but I will say I think that connects kind of to what I was saying about the concept of and problems with provenance as this like obsessively guiding principle. You know, because one person or one team of surveyors decided to draw the line of a community in one place doesn't necessarily mean that that's what everyone in that region is going to identify with. And but that is what's being carried along in the historic record. And so I think again, I mean, it's really just about the history and context. And I think there's a lot um, within archival finding aids in either the biographical or historical scope section of the finding aid where you can just provide a little bit more of that context, you know, explain that these designations maybe were kind of arbitrary and so I think really a lot of it is just comes back to giving a better context.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question that's coming in from the chat. What are your thoughts on adapting archival education? I keep running into the idea that the way we become qualified as archivists is to go through a very specific type of college education. Sometimes I wonder if that limits who can and will want to join the profession.
Absolutely, it limits who can and will want to join the profession. I mean, you know, again, I went through an archives and preservation focused program at a library school. You know, it was 20 years ago at this point, but I think I don't know that it has changed a huge amount. You know, these programs require internships, and these programs are very challenging to focus on if you are working full time. And so yes, even pursuing advanced degrees and and undergraduate degrees and associate's degrees, pursuing any, you know, kind of uh, post K-12 education comes with a certain level of privilege. So yes, I think absolutely that is the case. I mean, I will say that um, the Society of American Archivists and other kind of regional archival network associations are doing a lot of work to try to provide scholarships to students or emerging professionals who don't fit the kind of hugely majority demographic mold of the rest of us. So, you know, that is one thing, but that it kind of can only go so far. So I would say that I am really excited by all the work that is being done with community archives and collecting activists. I can't say that's a solution that necessarily comes with a lot of funding and, you know, career stability, but I think it is an alternate route for folks who might just be kind of passionate about this work, but aren't coming at it with the same levels of privilege.
So, Dyani, we have one more question in the chat, and I think I'm going to wrap up after this. So, just because I see we are almost at time, but it's a great question, and I want to get to it, which is, do you find that the harmful language warnings could aid in allowing people to rationalize avoiding certain information and therefore increase a person's level of distress when approaching these materials. And they're citing a paper by Sampson, Strange, and Gary from 2019. Could a deeper dive into museum anthropology and how they approach sensitive materials be helpful in evaluating the effectiveness of these statements?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point as well. And yeah, I mean, like all of the kind of suggestions, popping a harmful language statement up on your website is not going to solve the problem. And in some ways, you may be absolutely right. There may be as you put it, increased levels of distress as well. But I think you know, it's just one way of going about it. It's just kind of one stab at acknowledging the language challenges and everything. And I mean, again, being like completely transparent, I have not done a deep dive into museum anthropology and how I know, you know, a bit about kind of didactic labels in exhibit spaces and whatnot, but not on any deep level. So yes, I think that is probably a really great venue to look for guiding this work.
Yeah,
yeah, I do think we have to wrap up. So
thank you.
Thank you so much. I will, if you do have other questions, you definitely please feel free to reach out. I did put my phone number up here, but email is definitely best. So I would encourage you to follow up, and I'd love to continue the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dyani. I mean, that was such a fascinating and inspiring talk. I also just wanted to give a big thanks to Camilla Dawson, who's been behind the scenes with all of the tech and setup for today's webinar. And we have to give another thanks, that, of course, to the National Endowment for the Humanities, the William Fenn Foundation, the Independence Foundation, and really to all of you for showing up today. Thank you for being here. Our next webinar will be Queering Digital Preservation on December 6th at noon. So that should be really exciting as well. We hope to see you there. And when this program ends, you're going to have a little survey that pops up after the window closes. And we would kindly ask that you fill out our survey and let us know how we're doing. Thanks again, and we hope to see everybody again soon at a future program. All right, bye.